In Europe, in August 1944, the air carried a distinctive smell. Iron rust mixed with scorched earth. The balance of the war had tipped, but a beast in the act of falling was most dangerous. Alan Crawford, on paper an impeccable Swiss Red Cross medical observer, sat in the back seat of an aging Mercedes sedan as it rolled along the quiet roads of the Bavarian countryside. He watched hedgerows and farmhouses pass like scenery in a stage set that had been emptied of applause. In truth, he was an OSS operative, a speck of dust scattered deep inside Germany. His mission codename was Wound Check. His objective was simple to state and difficult to confirm: verify Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's true condition after the air attack he suffered in Normandy, estimate when the Desert Fox might return to command, and, if possible, take the measure of his psychological state and political posture. Berlin offered only fragments. That scarcity unsettled Allied leadership. A recovered Rommel put back into service, even as a symbol, could lift Western Front morale in ways that were hard to quantify. Crawford's cover was built for routine scrutiny. He spoke fluent German with a faint Bern accent. His briefcase held formal letters from the Swiss Medical Association Neutral Observer credentials and notes that read as academic work on post-traumatic complications, head injuries, fractures, infection risk, the slow violence of recovery. His papers were clean, his story consistent, and his questions framed as research. The role did not demand invisibility, it demanded credibility. He took a room in a quiet Ulm hotel. Ulm was large enough to swallow a stranger, and orderly enough that a neutral observer could be explained. It was also close enough to Herrlingen, where the Rommel family villa stood, to make day trips plausible, while still leaving him room to claim a broader regional survey. The location mattered for another reason. If he had to leave, routes toward the Swiss border were within reach. His first approach followed strict bureaucracy. He visited the local military medical department, produced his paperwork, and expressed scholarly interest in medical provision for distinguished German commanders. A mid-level officer received him politely and at arm's length. Rommel's name produced caution, then silence. The officer offered brochures on general hospital procedures and a few sentences about the Reich's commitment to care for its wounded. Crawford asked about rehabilitation standards, specialty wards, outside consultations, and the special conditions that might apply to a field marshal. The answers remained smooth and empty. Crawford left with paper that said nothing, but with a clearer sense of the firewall's shape. Rommel was not merely protected from enemies, he was protected from curiosity. Back at the hotel, he behaved like what his papers claimed, a neutral physician collecting impressions. He wrote harmless notes in the open about clinic capacity and wartime hygiene, the sort of material that bored officials and reassured anyone reading over his shoulder. The real summary: Rommel's recovery likely possible. The situation, politically volatile, was reduced to coded fragments he could reconstruct only with a separate key. He reviewed his emergency signals, the dead drop schedule, and the rule that any serious deviation meant immediate withdrawal. Ulm was not Berlin. Small anomalies traveled fast. He could not afford a casual pattern. The opening came 3 days later in a cafe. Through a vague introduction by an intermediary, Crawford ran into a young medical captain named Erich Koch. Koch had served at a Paris military hospital and had recently been transferred to Ulm for health reasons, now holding a nominal post at the garrison hospital. His face was drawn, his eyes carrying the dimness of a man who had seen too much blood and too little meaning. He drank as if beer were a sedative, not a pleasure. Crawford kept the conversation inside safe boundaries: medicine, exhaustion, the small logistics of keeping people alive, so that confession, if it came, would feel voluntary rather than extracted. Koch talked about Paris the way a man talks about a fever dream: wards overcrowded, supplies late, surgeons forced to improvise, and paperwork that never admitted how close the system ran to collapse. Crawford listened and let the young captain feel like the expert. When he asked questions, he asked about technique, how to stabilize a patient with head trauma, what a fractured skull looked like after a blast, not about names. A physician could speak of symptoms without sounding disloyal. An investigator could not. "Sometimes," Koch murmured, staring into the dusk beyond the window, "the speed at which we patch bodies is nowhere near the speed at which they're destroyed." Crawford did not answer. He offered a Swiss cigarette at the right moment. Silence, offered without pressure, could do what questioning could not. Koch smoked as if the act itself required concentration. By the time Koch mentioned distinguished patients, he was already halfway to confession. Crawford's role was to make the confession seem like relief rather than risk. He nodded at the right moment, offered one skeptical remark about overworked hospital administration, and waited. When Koch finally spoke about the Field Marshal, it came out as if it had been lodged behind his teeth for weeks. Their second meeting was in Koch's cramped apartment. Under the pretext of discussing coordinated treatment for cranial trauma and complex fractures, Crawford guided the conversation toward what high-ranking commanders might receive. Koch still chose words as if each one could be counted against him, but he said he had heard colleagues in Paris talking. The Field Marshal's injuries were severe, yet the operation had been successful and had not struck the brain in a critical way. A man could be disoriented and still heal. A man could lose blood and still recover. "Given the Field Marshal's constitution," Koch said carefully, "and given the resources that can be mobilized, time becomes the decisive factor." Crawford kept his reaction buried. That was the confirmation he needed. Rommel was not permanently out of play. He pressed for rehabilitation detail in an academic tone, timelines, expected limitations, the kind of follow-on monitoring a man of Rommel's stature might receive. Koch stopped abruptly, alarm flashing as if he realized he had gone too far. "These are unverified rumors, Doctor," he said. "You should rely on official communiques." His voice was flat, but his hands shook. When Crawford left the apartment, he did not look back. He walked 2 blocks before allowing himself to inhale properly. If Koch was being watched, any sign of gratitude or urgency could translate into suspicion. He noted only what mattered: the substance of Koch's claim, the abrupt change in Koch's posture when he realized he had crossed a line, and the fact that fear, not loyalty, had set that line. 2 days later, Koch missed their agreed cafe meeting. When Crawford called the apartment, a cold stranger answered, claiming to be a relative. Koch had received sudden orders to a field hospital on the Eastern Front, departing immediately, unable to say goodbye. The line was cut. It was not merely the loss of a source. It was a warning. A transfer that fast and absolute was not normal personnel management. Crawford went into scrub mode, checking his hotel room, reviewing every contact, replaying each sentence for what it might have sounded like to an eavesdropper. He saw no obvious sign he had exposed himself. The risk likely lay with Koch. He may already have been watched, and his association with a neutral observer had triggered a response. Crawford turned to external observation. Rommel's villa in Herrlingen looked unremarkable, but from a distant hillside his binoculars caught the mismatch. Beyond fixed sentries, plainclothes men loitered at the neighborhood edges as if out for a stroll, and vehicles with SS security service plates moved slowly along the access road. The density felt less like protection than custody. A system that truly wanted to protect a wounded hero would have been visible in uniforms and ceremony. This was quieter, denser, and more suspicious. One afternoon, a black sedan stopped, and two men in trench coats hurried inside. Another time, a different car lingered at the corner long after the street should have emptied. Crawford never saw visitors who looked like friends. The villa did not look like a convalescent refuge. It looked like a controlled site. The atmosphere around Rommel was more dangerous than the injury itself. Crawford understood he was standing at the calm outer ring of a storm, and his orders remained unchanged. Determine the injuries. He needed another fulcrum, and time was narrowing. Germany's October cold arrived early. At midday on October 14, 1944, the hotel dining room radio carried an announcer's careful grief. We declare with profound sorrow that Army Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, as a result of severe brain injury complications from the grievous wounds he sustained on July 17th, has died today at his home in Herrlingen. The room went silent. Diners froze with forks, half raised, their faces showing dazed shock rather than clean mourning. Crawford set down his spoon. Brain injury complications did not align with Koch's guarded claim that functional recovery looked favorable. The announcement arrived too complete, too fast, as if drafted in advance and waiting for a date to be inserted. It was not the voice of surprise, it was the voice of a file being closed. Within hours, a more detailed notice emphasized a state funeral ordered by the Führer, yet insisted the ceremony would be private and conducted with speed, in light of the frontline situation and to respect the family. The haste was abnormal. A field marshal's funeral was typically staged as spectacle and discipline. Here, efficiency dominated, as if the aim were not to display loyalty but to lock a narrative in place before doubts could gather. Crawford sent an encrypted message through a dead-drop channel to his handler, codename Clockmaker, reporting the change and requesting instructions. The reply arrived before dawn as a coded business call. Clockmaker ordered him to destroy all records tied to wound check, pack at once, and prepare for a new procurement list from Zurich headquarters. Headquarters has no interest in the previous batch of unsold samples, the voice said. Liquidate and do not follow up. The meaning was clear. The mission had ended. Crawford did what procedure demanded. He burned the smallest notes, dissolved what could be dissolved, and reduced the rest to innocuous fragments. He practiced his cover story again, medical observer, study neutral travel, until it felt like muscle memory. Reason agreed with withdrawal. The mission's core objective, confirming Rommel's injuries were survivable, had been met, and Rommel's death erased the timetable question. Each additional hour inside Germany was needless risk. Obedience was not a virtue in itself, but it was the spine of survival. But instinct resisted. The timing was too neat, landing at the edge of recovery. The story control was too urgent. Koch's disappearance and the surveillance around Herrlingen suggested a darker possibility. Not a medical ending, but a political period. Crawford gave himself 48 hours, not to prove a conspiracy in full, but to touch the wall and see whether a crack existed. If he left now, he would report that Rommel had died and the operation had been successful. If he stayed, he might learn why the story felt manufactured. He began with low-risk collection. At Ulm City Hall and local newspaper archives, he claimed academic need to study public reactions to prominent deaths and asked to review notices and draft copy. He found the funeral notices had moved with remarkable speed, stamps and procedures so complete they felt rigid. At a small paper, a tired editor muttered, "The copy came from above. They wouldn't let us change a single word. They even sent layout instructions like they were afraid we'd get something wrong." A field marshal had become a template. Street whispers carried the same theme. Buying a paper, Crawford overheard 2 housewives. "The marshal's wife is ill and sees no one." The reply came heavy with meaning. In that situation, who wouldn't be ill? Isolation surfaced again, not as a rumor, but as a method. He activated a backup channel, a black market intermediary loyal only to money, codename Mole. Crawford paid well and asked for any undertakers, florists or craftsmen in Herrlingen or Ulm who had been urgently pulled into the private state funeral, and whether they mentioned anything unusual afterward. Mole's response arrived as a slip of paper left behind a public lavatory partition. "Couldn't find your florist. A swarm has been very active nearby, especially interested in foreign breeds." Swarm was Mole's local shorthand for the Gestapo, or SD. The message was not an answer, it was a warning. When Crawford returned to his hotel room, the warning sharpened. A nearly invisible short hair he had wedged in the door seam was gone. Someone had entered. There was no disorder, no broken placement marks. The visitor had come to confirm, not rummage. Crawford checked his drawers and his suitcase seams, then lowered himself as if tying a shoe and scanned the floor for dust displacement. In the wardrobe's inside corner, he found a minute, fresh scratch consistent with a small listening device base that had been set down briefly and removed. It meant a background check had begun, perhaps through Koch, perhaps through his academic probing, and it was nearing the core of his fabricated identity. His paperwork could withstand routine inspection, but targeted digging backed by real resources always carried a point of collapse. Leaving immediately was rational, and his emergency route could take him toward the Swiss border. Yet Rommel's death now looked like a story being forced into place, and the intelligence value might exceed the original medical mission. OSS pre-mission reporting had marked an auxiliary facility on Ulm's outskirts, nominally a regional archive backup point for postal and communications inspection, but also used for temporary storage and transfer of low-classified peripheral files for the SS Security Service. It was not guarded like a major headquarters, but internal circulars touching sensitive local matters could pass through it. The risk was real, but the window was closing. On the eve of action, Crawford barely slept. He studied a hand-drawn map until he could picture corners and choke points with his eyes closed. He prepared minimal gear, dark civilian clothes, soft-soled shoes, a multi-purpose tool knife, a pen flashlight, and a small packet of flour. The flour was a petty thing, but petty things had saved lives. No gun. A gun would turn any contact into a dead end, and a dead end was exactly what the security services wanted. The next night was starless under heavy clouds. He slipped out of the hotel like a shadow and approached the target using alleys and the backs of warehouses. The building was 3 stories of brick, most windows dark. He climbed a drain pipe on the shaded side and worked an old second-floor transom latch until it gave with a faint click. Inside, dust and old paper clogged the air. The smell was paper, ink, and a faint chemical bite from old adhesives. He moved fast, light muffled by cloth, ears tuned for any sound beyond a distant boiler rumble. Most cabinets held routine security reporting and surveillance summaries, lists, stamps, signatures, the dead language of control. In a section labeled Local Security Directives and Supplemental Circulars 1934 to 1944, he found a thin file sleeve marked Local Affairs Related to High-Status Individuals. Reference. Dated August to October 1944. It held typed copies of background notices sent down for local units. A late September circular ordered absolute calm in designated convalescent areas, preventing irregular visitors and rumor spread. The described area covered Herrlingen. Another from early October carried the title Disciplinary Notes on the Handling of Wounded Military Personnel with National Prominence. It warned against hero worship that could deviate from National Socialist collective principles and insisted convalescents not be disturbed by external ideological currents. In the final paragraph, the language turned colder and less medical. Directives about restriction, monitoring, and appropriate conclusions delivered without a trace of human consequence. The most damning detail was not a name but a tone. The circular did not read like protection, it read like containment. Its key instruction treated the wounded leader as a problem to be managed until the problem solved itself. The phrase "until the subject's condition undergoes a fundamental shift consistent with expectations" carried a bureaucratic chill because it did not specify recovery. It specified an outcome. Crawford copied nothing. He did not need a stolen page. He needed the sentence to survive in his memory, a fundamental shift. In that language, it could mean recovery or an ending. Rommel had been reduced to an object to be managed, watched, and pushed toward the expected state. This was not medicine, it was security doctrine disguised as compassion. A hinge squealed downstairs. Men's voices and footsteps followed. Crawford killed the flashlight and pressed into the shadow between cabinets. The steps paused, checked a lock, then began climbing toward the second floor. Crawford's pulse slowed into something precise. He waited for the rhythm of weight on stairs, the pause at the landing, the sort of pauses men made when they expected to find nothing but still wanted to be thorough. He returned the sleeve to its place, dusted a thin scatter of flour where he had stood to leave faint footprint outlines, then slid to the transom and slipped out, half hooking the latch behind him. He descended the drain pipe. The instant he vanished into the yard's darkness, the archive room light snapped on above, and a puzzled voice sounded. Crawford did not run in a straight line. He took the most convoluted retreat route he had mapped, looping through alleys, pausing behind corners to listen, then moving again when the city's noise covered him. Back near the hotel district, he confirmed he was not being followed and re-entered quietly. He sat in the dark and fit the pieces together. Koch's forced disappearance, surveillance around Herrlingen, the rushed funeral, the rigidly controlled copy, and the circular's cold phrasing. Rommel's death from wounds now looked like a procedural resolution of a political risk, an adjustment executed with paperwork, custody, and a story told at speed. Before dawn, engine noise began to sweep the streets, slower and denser than ordinary patrol. Through a slit in the curtains, Crawford watched a dark sedan move past too slowly, as if reading window numbers. The silhouettes were hard-edged, not local police, Gestapo or SD action men. The net was tightening, and his time had collapsed from hours to minutes. If his preset routes were covered, he needed a move that broke expectation. The only human thread left was Koch. Finding Koch was impossible, but Koch's family might exist, and any trace would be where the security services least wanted it, in a frightened household. The risk was extreme. Koch's circle could be watched, yet it was the only path to living evidence beyond bureaucratic doctrine. Crawford remembered Koch's apartment, an overturned picture frame on a desk, as if a private life had been flipped face down. If he could locate the face behind that frame, he might find a sentence that did not come from a circular. At first light, Crawford changed into old work clothes, pulled on a flat cap, and smeared engine grease on his face. He hid microfilm and notes in a belt compartment and moved like an early laborer toward the cafe. The owner looked half asleep. Crawford used a thick local dialect and mumbled that he was looking for Eric's cousin with urgent news from home. The owner frowned. "Erich, Dr. Koch, he's gone. Transferred out." Crawford pressed with a simple story. Aunt Helena ill at Sacred Heart Hospital, a need to find Eric's sister Margarete. The owner grunted, annoyed but not alarmed. "Margareta? Maybe the sewing shop near the old post office in the East End. Not sure. Eric mentioned it once or twice." He waved Crawford away as if pushing away a nuisance. Crawford left at once. He ran counter-surveillance in a wide loop, watching reflections in windows, pausing under the excuse of a man tightening a bootlace, then walking again with his shoulders slumped to look like any worker tired before the day began. He found the sewing shop and watched from across the street, counting patterns, who passed, who lingered, how often the street corner changed hands. After half an hour, a thin young woman, 18 or 19, with features faintly like Koch's, stepped out to dump trash. Her expression drained. When she went for water at a public spigot, Crawford approached close and spoke low and fast. Dr. Eric Koch in Paris cared for an important patient. He told me to tell his family his diagnosis was not wrong, but someone did not want the patient to recover. He wants to know if home is safe. She froze, not in confusion but in fear. Her bucket fell and water splashed across stone. Her face drained to a color that looked like hunger. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who may have seen what your brother saw," Crawford said. "One question. Before he left or after strangers came asking questions, did anyone mention Herrlingen, or the day the Field Marshal died? Did anything unusual happen?" Tears rose as if fear had been waiting for permission. 10 days ago strangers came," she said. "They asked what Eric said. Mama was terrified and fell ill. Eric sent a letter secretly. One sentence. He told me to memorize it and burn it." "What sentence?" Crawford asked, and felt the question in his throat like a hook. She leaned in. "He wrote, 'If the fox is visited in its den by hunters, it is never because of the wound.'" She swallowed hard. "And Hans the grocer, his nephew did garden work in Herrlingen, told Mama that on the morning the marshal died, a very large black sedan arrived. 2 men who looked like generals went into the house. Then that afternoon they announced it. Hans said never repeat it. He said it's poisonous. Fox hunters. Not the wound. 2 generals in a black sedan. The circulars, fundamental shift. The surveillance, Koch's disappearance, and the rushed funeral snapped into a single shape, a quiet visit executed from the top, forcing a man to end himself under the weight of state power and family leverage. It was not a medical tragedy, it was a program. "Thank you," Crawford said. "Forget you saw me." He shoved his remaining cash into her bucket and turned away. Within minutes, an engine roared and brakes shrieked from the sewing shop direction. They were too fast. Either the cafe owner had reported his questions or the family was already under intermittent watch and his contact had been observed. The hounds were loose. Crawford ran away from his hotel and toward the dense worker districts at the city's edge, using back passages, courtyards, and sudden turns to break sightlines. Sirens rose behind him. Engine noise split, one group cutting along main roads while others moved on foot into the alleys with sharp commands. He heard boots on stone, then the metallic certainty of a weapon being handled, not fired yet, but made ready. A dead-end passage forced him into a quick, ugly choice. He toppled a stack of rotting crates into the alley mouth, buying a few seconds of dust and confusion, then climbed a low wall into a backyard. The yard belonged to a small print shop, the air thick with ink and paper. Workers stared at the filthy man who dropped in among them. Crawford threw his hands up and shouted in broken German, even letting a French word slip, as if panicked. A madman with a knife was chasing him. He pointed back toward the alley, as if expecting the attacker to appear at any moment. The workers shouted questions. Crawford shouted over them, turning the yard into noise and motion. Behind him, voices swelled and then split, as if the pursuers were fanning out to close streets in a grid. He caught a glimpse of a dark sedan nosing into an intersection and understood they were reading the city like a diagram. The longer he stayed among buildings, the more predictable he became. Water broke patterns, water erased footprints. The river was not safety, but it was uncertainty, and uncertainty was leverage. While the worker's attention swung toward his lie, he cut through the workshop, exited the front, and merged with the morning flow of commuters. He tore off his dirtiest outer layer, raked his hair back, and forced his pace down to a hurried walk. He looked like a worker late for a shift. At a corner, a boy pasted up the day's paper. The headline announced Rommel's funeral with an old photograph, a sharp-eyed portrait that mocked the claim of a slow death from injuries. The sight was a jolt, both confirmation and warning. He did not pause. Near the Neckar River, a junction ahead was partially blocked by a sedan and men conducting checks. Crawford diverted down a narrow path and took wet stone steps to the bank. A shouted order followed him. He did not stop. At a small freight dock, he climbed onto an old barge and slipped into a low cabin among sacks and shadow. Footsteps paced the dock and came aboard, boards creaking. Voices argued with early dock workers, sharp and impatient, demanding names and documents. The dock workers complained loudly, and for a moment the argument widened the search in the wrong direction. The cabin had one small hatch at the far side. Crawford slid it aside, lowered himself into the murky water, and let the cold seize him before he could flinch. He went under, swam hard in the barge's shadow, and reached reeds on the opposite bank. The river water was a shock that turned thought into reflex. He lay in the reeds until the patrol rhythm broke, until engines grew intermittent, until voices moved away from the water. He squeezed water from his clothes, could not light a fire, and waited for his breathing to slow. When he moved again, he moved as if every sound could be a trigger. Minutes stretched into an hour. His muscles cramped with cold, and the urge to shiver threatened to give him away. He kept his teeth from chattering by clenching his jaw until it hurt. Somewhere upstream, a motor idled, then moved on. When he finally rose, he did it in stages, first to a crouch, then to a half-stand, so that the reeds would not suddenly sway in a way that looked like a human silhouette. By evening, he was leaving Ulm by remote routes, avoiding roads, navigating toward a predetermined emergency rendezvous, a derelict hunter's cabin on the edge of the Black Forest, near the Swiss border. The next 2 days and nights blurred into exhaustion and discipline. He kept off paths, navigated by a crude compass and the sky when it was visible, ate what he carried and what he could find, and flinched at every irregular sound. What sustained him were the fragments that now fit, Margaret's terror, the circular's phrase, and the image of a black sedan arriving at Herrlingen. He had not merely checked a wound, he had watched a system cut away a part it could no longer control. He moved mostly at night and rested in shallow cover by day, sleeping in short bursts that never became real sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the black sedan at Herrlingen and heard Margaret's word, poisonous, as if it were a warning about speech itself. He crossed low ground slowly, avoided bridges, and treated every distant light as a possible checkpoint. Hunger arrived like a dull pressure and stayed. He kept going because stopping meant capture, and capture meant a different kind of silence, the kind that gets rewritten back into official language. On the third morning, nearly collapsed, he reached the hunter's cabin and found the agreed marker intact. He waited inside, counting minutes by the change in the cold air. When the knock came, 3 long, 2 short, he did not answer at once. He listened for a second rhythm, a second set of feet, then he unlatched the door. A plain-faced man in Bavarian peasant clothes entered, code name Woodcutter. There was no greeting, dry clothes, hot soup, new papers. An hour later, Crawford was an Austrian small trader whose timber deal had failed. His new photograph showed the right fatigue and the right defeated expression. It was the sort of face no one wanted to study longer than necessary. They drove a winding mountain road toward the final checkpoint. The line was short, the mood tense. SS soldiers inspected documents and cargo. Woodcutter complained about weather and bureaucrats and handed over their papers. A flashlight beam cut across Crawford's face, and the soldier compared it to the photograph. The seconds stretched into a stillness Crawford could feel in his teeth. "Why are you going to Switzerland?" the soldier asked. "Collecting debts, sir," Crawford muttered in German with an Austrian accent. "The timber business went bad. The Swiss partner might still have a way."
The soldier searched the truck bed, then waved them through. The wheels rolled across the border into Swiss territory. When the first sign marked with the Swiss Federal Cross appeared, Crawford felt no relief, only deep fatigue and a colder clarity. He was safe, but the Germany he had left, consuming itself with bureaucratic precision, had burned into him. In a nondescript safe house in Bern, he gave Clockmaker a full debrief. He did not dramatize the chase. He laid out the fragments, the reasoning, and the conclusion. His report was concise, its core paragraph blunt. Evidence indicates Field Marshal Rommel's death did not arise from his wounds, nor directly from specific involvement in the July 20th incident. The cause of death was that within the broader context of Nazi military political collapse, his uncontrolled personal prestige was assessed by the Führer's circle as a political threat. Observations indicate custody-level security around Herrlingen, accelerated, centrally controlled public narrative, and local SD directives framing the subject as an object to be managed until a fundamental shift consistent with expectations. Secondary human source indicators suggest a coercive visit to Herrlingen by senior figures consistent with forcing a self-inflicted end under state pressure. Clockmaker did not interrupt. He let Crawford finish, then asked only the questions that tested structure. What was observation? What was inference? What might be deliberate deception? Crawford answered methodically. He was careful to separate what he had read, what he had heard from Margaret, and what he concluded from Patton. The file sentence, the black sedan with 2 generals, the accelerated funeral, together they formed a consistent mechanism. Alone, each could be dismissed. Together they described the system that produced them. At the end, Crawford added a practical recommendation. In assessing enemy morale, we may benefit from exploiting this lethal suspicion between top leadership and the front, between heroes and the system. For rank-and-file soldiers, fear of being removed by their own side may exceed fear of the enemy. Clockmaker listened in silence for a long moment, then nodded once. "You completed the mission beyond requirements," he said. "The cost wasn't small. This report describes a pathology. Rest, Doctor." Crawford went to the window. Bern's night was quiet and orderly, as if a different world from the land behind him. He had completed wound check, but what he had examined was not a single man's injury. It was the pulse of an empire in its death spasm, and the cold logic that could destroy even its finest components. That knowledge would stay with him. War was not only fought at the front. Sometimes understanding how an enemy devours itself mattered just as much.